All right, guys. Hope you're having a good afternoon here on this Monday. Um, we are on Unit 3, Session 2. So we are on Unit 3, Session 2. Your text is mainly going to be in Genesis chapter 14. And also, we're going to parallel it to Hebrews 7. These passages run together. So Genesis 14 and Hebrews 7. And I'm going to go ahead and give you a warning up front. This video may be a little longer. But I think it deserves that because we're talking about a pretty important topic this this week in Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is probably one of the least talked about people in the Bible that should be talked about a lot more. And we're going to see why as we kind of break this down and talk through this. So just a couple things before we start. Your curriculum kind of goes to the narrative of Genesis 14, which is Abram rescuing his nephew Lot. And so, Lot moves to Sodom and there's a war, and basically Lot gets taken as collateral, and Abram goes and he rescues his nephew. You got to remember, Abram didn't have any children, and so his nephews and nieces were probably more like children to him than anyone else. And so there's something to be said there, and the narrative is important. But I want to focus on just verses 17 through 20 when we talk about Melchizedek and who he is. Again, like I said, it's something that's not talked about a whole lot, and this narrative is bookended. This narrative of 17 through 20 in chapter 14, where we talk about Melchizedek, and that's all we really get. It's just a few verses. You've got right before that is the battle in which Abram rescues Lot. And then right after that is actually a text that we read last week in Genesis 15, verses 1 through 6, when we see the Abrahamic covenant, where God says, your offspring is going to be more numerous than the stars of the sky, right? And so we see that here in this passage. And so the bookends are important because that's why Melchizedek does what he does in verses 17 through 20. So let's answer a few questions just to focus on what we're talking about. So I think we can answer this in three simple questions. All right. And so the first one is, who is Melchizedek? Who is Melchizedek? Well, we meet Melchizedek, and it's a brief, small portion there, but like I said, a big impact. Melchizedek was both priest and king. Okay, so he was both priest and king. Who else do we know that was both priest and king? Right? It's Jesus. So right off the bat, you know where we're going with this. Only other person in Scripture that's both priest and king is Jesus. And so we see that. His name, the meaning of his name, gives this away to us. Melchizedek literally means king of righteousness. And then he was the king of Salem, which was a shortening of Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem means peace. So in his name, or in his identity, Melchizedek, king of Salem, you have king of righteousness and peace. Is what we have there. And ultimately what we see Melchizedek doing is he becomes this mediator between God and Abram, because he's going to cast a blessing. And that leads us to our second question. Number two, what does Melchizedek do? What does Melchizedek do? Well, he blesses Abram. All right. Literally, the text reads, Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you. That's all he says. But he blesses Abram, and the only person that has the authority to give the blessing of God is God himself. And he uses a mediator, right? We see in the rest of the Old Testament, he uses priests. He uses some of these kings, or uses Moses, right? All these different things. However, one thing we've got to think about is that Moses and the law of the Old Testament that we see given in the book of Exodus hasn't taken place yet. So there is no temple, there is no tabernacle, there is no priesthood, there is no nation of Israel at this point. And so our only point of understanding for who a priest is takes place right here. And so the only one, like I said, the only one that is given authority to be a priest or to give the blessing of God is God himself, working through a human person. Right. And so he blesses Melchizedek blesses Abram, and we see that Melchizedek was this mediator, right? This go-between God and Abram, so that Abram could receive the blessing. There's also, if you notice, the author of Genesis, the one that wrote all this down, was Moses, right? And his life would take place years later. But when he's writing, he's the one that authored the book of Genesis. So that's important for us to know, because in most of the characters that he introduces, he gives a genealogy. He wants the people to know where this person came from. But there is no genealogy for Melchizedek. There is no genealogy, and I believe that is, at least from a literary standpoint, to indicate in the same way that Jesus has no beginning or no end, nor does Melchizedek. Now, I'm going to talk about this in here in just a second, but we do believe that conservative scholars would say that Melchizedek was a real human person. This was not Jesus in a pre-incarnate state. This was a real person that God used to bless Abram. And so he really did have a father and a mother, and he did have more than likely children of his own. But from a literary standpoint, the author wants us to understand that in the same way that Jesus has no beginning, right, or no end, so does Melchizedek, right? It's signifying who Jesus is. And that leads us to our last point, our last question, and that's, is this Jesus? Is this, in Genesis 14, is this Jesus? I would say yes and no. Yes and no. Melchizedek, like many in the Old Testament, is a type of Christ. Now, we don't mean like a type of dessert, like chocolate or strawberry. That's not what we're talking about. When we say type of Christ, or when we say that someone in the Old Testament typifies Christ, what that means is that they point to Jesus, either in a role that Jesus served under, or something that Jesus would ultimately bring the full fulfillment in. Melchizedek here serves as a type of Christ in being both priest and king, which we know that Jesus would do, right? He's our great high priest, the one that intercedes for us. And he's also the king of the universe, the one that is in charge and has full authority and all power in the universe. And so some examples of types of Christ, there's many in the Old Testament. Moses himself was a type of Christ. Abraham himself was a type of Christ, right? We can look at particular examples, though. Moses, he mediated for the people, right? When the children of Israel are in the wilderness, he's the one that goes up on the mountain and receives the law. He mediates because the law is meant for the people. So God has to mediate that through someone else. You got the people, you got God. Moses is that mediator, right? King David was a type of Christ, and that he was a king that sought after God's own heart. And in fact, he would actually be the one that one of his great grandsons all the way down would be Jesus. He would come from the line of David. And there's some people that would say that this is a pre-incarnate Christ, or a Christophany, which is the actual theological word for that. But we don't believe that necessarily. We know Christ is eternal, and certainly he could have done this if he wanted to. But the Bible only speaks of his first coming and his second coming, right? His first coming being the time when he comes to this earth in the form of a baby born in Bethlehem, right? John 1:14 says that the word that was in the beginning, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that's written in the context of Jesus coming, being born of the Virgin Mary. The second coming being when he comes back as the judge, to judge the living and the dead. There's no other indications in Scripture that indicates any more arrivals of Jesus here on earth. And so that's why we would not say that this is a type, or this is a pre-incarnate state of Christ. So I know there's a lot of material, and I'm sure you're probably a little confused right now. However, again, what we want to emphasize is who Melchizedek is. Okay, he's priest and king. The only other person that could do that, or that ever would do that, would be Jesus himself, right? In the Old Testament, we see that the priest and the king often had two different motives. They certainly had two different roles. But God himself sent his son Jesus to be both our priest and our king, right? The priest that would mediate for us, that would make sacrifice and make atonement on our behalf so that we could be right with God. We saw that take place on the cross. That's how he's our priest. And then also we see how he is our king and how he is the king of the universe, the king of righteousness, the king of all that is good, right? The creator of our universe. And so I hope you may have to go back and watch it a couple of times. There's great resources if you want to look at some commentaries. Your curriculum does a great job of talking about some of this stuff as well. But the reality is, I want you to know who Melchizedek is and what he represents, because ultimately, when we see the Abrahamic covenant made in the next chapter, we know that God has an eternal game or an eternal game plan in mind here. It wasn't just a temporary covenant. This would be ultimately be what would point to our salvation that we experience today. So I hope that helps you guys. And thank you so much for your faithfulness. And thank you for listening to an 11-minute video. That is dedication. Love you guys. Thank you so much.